I'm speaking with Sandy Phillips Kirkham today, and she is a survivor of clergy sexual abuse. She has written a book entitled I Pray Upon You. Is that correct? Did I get that correctly?
It's Let Me Pray
I'm
Upon
sorry.
You.
Yes, Let Me Pray Upon You. And she is, and the book talks about her abuse, and then it talks about her subsequent healing that's lasted over the course of her life since then. She conducts victim conferences and has spoken to various groups and organizations. Sandy, thank you so much for joining me today. I truly appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you.
You bet. Thank you. So again, my podcast is entitled Everyone Has a Story. So I want to find out just a little bit about you and about your life growing up and what was that like? Where are you from and where did you grow up at?
I grew up in Cincinnati. I've lived here all my life.
Okay.
I'm the oldest of 5. My parents were divorced when I was about 7.
Okay.
So that was really probably the most impacted my life, throughout my life, really.
Sure.
But basically, I had a good childhood, but I didn't have a church life. My parents didn't attend church, so that was kind of lacking. Mm-hmm. And then my best friend who lived up the street invited me to go to church with her one Sunday, and I went every Sunday after that, and it was just a place I really enjoyed being.
Okay. And what age did you say that was again that you started going to church?
About 8 years old.
8 years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so what really attracted you? What was so much, what did you like so much about church?
Well, for one thing, it was a safe place for me to land. Like I said, I was the oldest of 5. I didn't see my dad very often, and so that was a void in my life. And church provided for me a secure place. It was a place that I got very involved in very quickly, and people there liked me, and I was special to them in many ways. And so it was a place I was validated, I think, and it was just a safe place to land. And I also found that I just truly did enjoy my faith. I was so happy to be a part of a church, and my faith was growing. I was involved in the church's ways. I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. I led church retreats. I mean, it would be no exaggeration to say that if the doors were open, I was there. It truly was a place that I loved.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, my life, I didn't have a dad as well. In fact, my mom and dad got divorced when I was about 1 year old. And so I guess you could say I had that void as well, and just had a real struggle growing up, was bullied incessantly because I was overweight. And when I was about 15, 16 years old, I was invited to a youth group for the first time. And like you said, it was the first place in my entire life where I ever actually felt loved for who I was. Right. I remember walking into the youth group doors and like 3 people just jump up and start hugging me. And I'm like, okay, what's going on here? But it was, it truly felt the love of Jesus. And it really, I've been a Christian for over 30 years because of that youth group. So I totally understand what you're saying.
And that's exactly what church should be, at a place where you're feeling special, you felt loved, cared for. And it's a place where you can grow in your faith.
Right. Absolutely. So you continue to go to church then as you were growing up and through your middle school years and right into the high school. And then so you started going to the youth group there at that church, that specific church?
Yes.
Okay. And how was that initially, going to youth group? Did you enjoy youth group? Was it fun?
Oh, absolutely. I was secretary of the youth group. I was always involved in every project. I was probably the leader of most of the fundraisers. It truly was, a place that I volunteered, and I just loved volunteering. And I felt like I was a part of growing God's kingdom. And it was what I carried my Bible to school with me every day. I tried to be a witness for Christ. I went to church camp every summer. It was, like I said, I was very happy there, and I was very committed and dedicated to my church and to God at that time. Okay.
So your story, if I understand it correctly, is that it was the youth group and a youth minister that that sexually abused you. Is that correct?
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about the story. Was this person involved in the youth group when you initially joined the youth group, or how did that happen?
No, I was baptized when I was 13, but I continued to be a part of the church. Just after I turned 16, our church did hire this youth minister. Okay. So he had come to our church with a lot of credit to his background as far as being able to grow youth groups, and he was very dynamic. He was really like any other pastor we'd ever seen. He was 30, and even though he was married with 2 children, he really was more involved with the youth. He dressed like we did. He knew our music. He went to our football games. I suppose, if you were going to use the word hip, that's what you would say about him.
Okay, sure.
His sermons were dynamic. He was just he was very touchy. He liked to hug people. I mean, this was the 70s, so, it was very physical kind of, this was new to us, but he was really different and special. People were just drawn to him. He was very charismatic. He was almost like a rock star.
Okay. And so tell me just then a little bit about what happened. What was the story exactly?
So, like I said, he was very, very charismatic, and everybody wanted to be involved with his ministry. So, when he asked you to do something, you felt very special. And of course, I was already involved in the church, so I was thrilled to have this new youth minister who was going to give us all kinds of new ideas and fun things to do. So it happened one night after a youth group meeting that was in my home. He waited for everyone to leave, and then he stopped me in my hallway and began telling me how much he appreciated me and how much he was thankful that I was in the church. And then he bent down and he kissed me. And I was stunned. I thought, I think he just kissed me, but I didn't know how to process it. And I thought, well, maybe I've misunderstood, and maybe this is just his way of showing how much he appreciates me. And so I didn't do anything with it. I just let it go. Now, I babysat for his family. His wife worked evenings. So this really gave him the perfect opportunity to continue the physicalness of the relationship. But a lot of times we would just spend sitting on his couch talking about the Bible, how we could get more kids involved in church. I mean, it didn't really seem unusual to me because, he was my pastor. And why would I think he would be doing anything he shouldn't be doing? But it took about a year, which is I call the grooming process and the setup of finally just getting me to the point where he one night had sex with me. And from that point on, I felt trapped. I felt trapped, and I also felt committed that I had agreed to have sex with this person, and now I was committed to him. It was all very confusing to me at the age. By this time, I'm 17. So I don't know what to do with this. And he says he loves me. He says he needs me in his ministry and that this was God's will. He claimed that God ordained this, that we were married in God's eyes. And so, I accepted that. I didn't know what else to do, so I accepted it. Now, the abuse lasted for 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Shortly after having sex with me, the relationship turned very dark. He became abusive. He became extremely controlling, just telling me what friends I could see, where I could go, what kind of clothes to wear. I was totally under his control. And there were a couple times that I tried to get out of the relationship. I told him I couldn't do this anymore, that guilt was overwhelming me. And he would respond in one of 2 ways. He would become very loving and very caring and beg me to stay and that he needed me, which, that was the guilt trip for me. But then he would become very angry, claiming that no one else was going to love me, that I wasn't a virgin, no one else would want me, that he was the only one. So it was a very controlling, very confusing. And so at one point in the relationship, I would say probably into 3 years, I just finally gave up and accepted that this was what was supposed to be my life, that this would only end when he said it would end. Now, it did end because he was caught. His actions were discovered by the elders, and it was decided that they would try to keep the information quiet. And so for about a month, I was told where to sit, how to behave in front of him, who I was to talk to. I was told not to tell my parents. But all that effort to kind of keep it under wraps failed because more people were suspicious. So finally, the elders decided that he had to make a confession to the church, which was very vague. He just simply said he had sinned, and he'd sinned against God, he'd sinned against his wife, and he asked for forgiveness. Just after that confession, he met me in a hotel room 2 days later.
Really? And so the confession was surface level. I mean, it was just something.
Absolutely. I mean, he had no intentions of ending this relationship. Now, after there was a vote among the elders as to whether they should keep him or not. They decided that he should be moved to the next church. Now, I did fail to mention that this wasn't his first time. right after he had been hired at our church, a young woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexual inappropriate behavior, which he didn't deny, but he said he was sorry and he said it would never happen again. Well, it happened again with me, only this time it went for 5 years, and it was much more, of a sexual relationship for 5 years. So anyway, he was moved to the next church.
Okay.
I was then called in by the elders and told because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. I was devastated. I loved that church, and being told that I wasn't fit to worship there was, and I've said this before, I think the fact that I was told to leave that church probably had more of an impact on my life afterwards than the actual abuse did.
It's hard to comprehend this. Especially in 2020. I have a feeling that your story is not incredibly unique, especially within the church, that you would be the one, it sounds like to me, to be blamed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And this youth pastor, is really kind of basically gets a slap on the hand and, good luck to you in the future and have a nice life. But there's no accountability that's being had for this man. And he was a sexual predator.
Absolutely. No question about it. Shortly after going to the next church, he got involved with a young woman in that church as well.
Oh, man.
And I think part of that is the fact, I would like to say that things have changed, but I talk to victims all the time, that it's still the supports given to the offending pastor. Right. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that we have a personal relationship with our ministers, and that they marry us, they baptize our children, they're sitting at our bedsides when we're dying. And so it's difficult then to imagine that these men have done anything so evil as this. And they want to be able to say, we want to be able to forgive, and everyone deserves a second chance. Yeah. The problem with giving these men second chances, you're giving them a second chance to reoffend.
Sure.
And there are consequences to behaviors, and one of those should be removal from ministry. They've broken the vows of their ordination vows. They have crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed, and they did so willingly.
Yeah.
And they need to be removed. That doesn't mean they can't be forgiven. It doesn't mean that they're disconnected from God, but it does mean they're removed from the pulpit.
Quite possibly forever. Honestly,
absolutely.
And there's plenty of things they can do. There's they can go be a door greeter at Walmart. They don't have to be in ministry.
And it's by their own actions they lost that privilege of ministry. It's by their own actions. And we have a higher standard for our physicians, our psychiatrists, our counselors, a social worker, anyone in the helping profession who's taken an oath to help another person. Mm-hmm. Once they break that oath by hurting and harming that person, they're removed from their profession.
Right.
A doctor having sex with one of his patients, he loses his license.
Yeah.
And everyone understands that.
So what this question is actually, it feels really kind of cheesy almost, but why didn't you say anything when you were going through that relationship, that 5-year span? Were you afraid? What was the reason?
Well, there's a couple reasons. First of all, he made it very clear once he crossed that line of having sex with me that if anyone were to ever find out, I would be responsible for what would happen to him, and I would be blamed. And then he would remind me that no one would believe me anyway. And I remember thinking, I don't even believe this has happened to me. Yeah. So I did. And I also at that time felt like if I were to tell anyone, it would reflect on me as well, that, I participate in this and I would be judged. And I also knew that by telling the congregation or anyone in the congregation what was going on, this was going to be a bombshell. Everyone loved this man, and I was going to come forward and discredit him. And keep in mind, he had created a relationship with me that was a dependency upon him. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to hurt him, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I did nothing.
Right. And that's why you didn't say no to him as well.
Right. Well, you don't say no because you're actually, and if you read the chapter that this first sexual encounter happened, I think it shows you how petrified I was, and how, they talk about when you have trauma or something as you're in danger, there's flight or there's fight, but there's also the third one, which is called freezing. You don't either fight or flee, you also freeze, which is what a lot of victims will tell you. I just froze. I let him touch me. I let him do whatever he was going to do because I was so scared I froze. And that's what I did. I just closed my eyes and pretended it wasn't happening.
That's tough. So wow. This is a tough conversation. And thank you for being, I know you've shared it many times, but thank you for being, willing to share it again and again. You mentioned the fact that when the church asked you to leave, that was actually tougher on you spiritually than the abuse was. Can you expand on that just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I believed that I could be forgiven. He was forgiven. Mm-hmm. I believed that, everyone could have a chance to ask for forgiveness. And I was sorry. And I believed I had done something. And the church had treated me like I had done something. And many of the people would say to me, we're going to forgive you. And so I understood that this was just as much my fault as it was his, not understanding that this was really an abuse of power in his position and that he had mm-hmm. no right in any shape or form as the shepherd to devour one of his sheep.
Right.
So the response of the church told me that I wasn't fit to be a child of God. And so I spent 27 years keeping this secret, and I spent 27 years with a disconnect from God and from the church. I attended church because I wanted my children to go to church, but I could not engage myself in the church. I got a knot in my stomach every time I walked past the pastor's office. For 27 years, every Sunday morning when I got near that office, I knew it was coming. I'd get this knot in my stomach, and then it would go away. That's how I behaved for 27 years in a church. I had many trigger factors. So you can't have a relationship with God as long as you're having these reminders of your abuse that happened within the walls of the church. I have a chapter called Spiritual Wounds in the book, and I talk about the spiritual disconnect and how that affected my spiritual life for 27 years.
Yeah. You were not
many victims will never go back to church, or they'll never find their way back spiritually.
Sure.
I always knew that God was not responsible, but I couldn't find my way back because there were so many reminders of what was done to me within the walls of the church.
Right.
And the response of the church. So it was very difficult for me to find that connection again. Sure. And it was sad. I mourned the loss of what I had. I literally wanted so desperately to find my way back, and I didn't know how. And part of that was because, again, I was hiding this secret for 27 years. Yeah. And so I had no one to talk to about it, and it helped create the division as well.
Yeah, well, and when we look at our leaders in the church as basically representatives of God, then it's really easy to have that disconnect, like you're talking about, between you and God, because you just feel like, okay, if that's what God is, then I don't want to have any part of him.
Right. And you can in your mind think, well, I know that that's not the way it is.
Sure.
But emotionally and what was done, when you're traumatized, and abuse certainly is a traumatic event in one's life, your ability to think clearly and to put the rational with the emotional and separate the two is very difficult to do. Mm-hmm. And even years later, I mean, I was affected by the things he had said and done to me 27 years later. Mm-hmm. And then I had a trigger factor that forced me to say, you have to deal with this. It's in chapter 1 of the book, where mm-hmm. I literally had this almost of a breakdown and a moment that I understood, okay, this wasn't right what he did to me, and I'm going to have to deal with it. And that began my journey of healing and my way back spiritually, and part of that healing required that I confront him. I mean, that was one of the things that I needed to do. In my own mind, I felt like I couldn't move past this until I confronted him and looked at him and said to him, you had no right to do what you did to me. Now, I didn't know where he was. I hadn't had any contact with him for 27 years. I didn't even know if he was alive. I hired a private investigator, and I found him ministering in a church.
Really? Still ministering 27 years later.
He's still ministering part-time today.
Really?
Oh, and this is after, now I confronted him, and I didn't see remorse. I saw excuses, but I was glad that I had that opportunity to do that. And he admitted that he'd had many instances over his career of a minister of sexual misconduct. He said that he'd been in therapy and he was identified as a sexual addict. And I'm thinking, this is what we want in our ministers. I mean, this man should not be in the ministry. His church leaders,
that's an understatement, honestly.
Yeah. His current church leaders basically heard my story and said, well, it's not important to us today. It doesn't have any bearing on who he is today. And they dismissed me. And I went to his national leaders, the president of the denomination where he was a minister, and I got the same response. Thank you for your story, but we can't do anything about it now, and it doesn't really affect what we want to do as far as hiring or firing him now.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I just felt it was a very frustrating process.
Yeah. Was this, when you did this confrontation of him and then of his church and then of his denomination, was this before the Me Too movement started to happen, or was this during the same time frame?
No, it was before the Me Too movement. It was in 2004 that I confronted him. And
okay. And so it's been a while.
Yes, and the Catholic issue was front and center. That was very much front and center.
Okay.
No, the Me Too movement had not, but that's what prompted me to write the book, was the Me Too movement.
Me Too, okay.
Because of the reaction of people saying, I don't understand why these women don't come forward when it happens. Or why do they wait so long?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I can tell you why. I can tell you. And then too, I had done some speaking engagements, and so many people would say to me, oh, your story is so powerful, you should write a book. And I think, I'm not a writer, and I don't really have an interest in doing that. But then I began to understand, and I think your podcast speaks to this, we all have stories in our lives, and our stories can help each other.
Absolutely.
And our stories are powerful, and they're important. They're important to tell. And so that's what prompted me to write the book, that I thought, because, Nate, I thought, if I had heard someone's story about abuse when this was happening to me, maybe it would have changed how I saw what was happening to me. And maybe I could have given me the courage to have gotten out.
Yeah.
So that's why I wrote the book, for those reasons, that I just felt it was important to educate people, to understand how the grooming and the manipulation and the gaslighting, all those terms that even today a lot of people will say, what's gaslighting?
Yeah.
And so I try to explain that in the book to help people understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy and excited that the Me Too movement kind of inspired you to write your story down. I recall at that moment I had a pretty decent presence on Twitter, and I was watching the vitriol come out from big religious leaders within the Christian world in America, and just attacking. Like I recall, I don't know if you know who Beth Moore is.
Yes.
But she shared her story, and holy cow, she was just totally demonized by that. I was like, what is going on here? By big names within the Christian church in the United States. I was just like, I just can't believe what's happening here.
Well, and what we need to understand is this isn't about, pastor bashing. This isn't about trying to hurt the church. This is about safety and integrity of the church.
Absolutely.
Victims should be welcomed with their stories so that we can learn from them, and that church leaders can understand the pain and devastation. So often, the sympathy has gone to the pastor or the offending pastor because, he's lost his ministry, he's going to lose his family. Yeah. He loses so much without any thought of what is the victim lost. That we live with this, the aftermath of our sexual abuse lives with us forever. We don't ever get over it. We learn to deal with it. We learn to heal from it, but it's always a part of us. I've tried not to let it define my life, but it will always be a part of my life. And so, we need to understand from a victim's point of view what this does to each of us. And the church is supposed to be bringing people in, not turning them away. And when we have And what they are, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're not true pastors. They're not shepherds. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. And so we need to remember that. And yes, we can, again, they can be forgiven if they're remorseful and repentant. We can help them, but you give that same help to the victim as well. And you never, ever blame the victim, because the pastor always has the responsibility of maintaining the boundaries. It's his job. And when someone comes to him with vulnerabilities and crisis in their life, they don't deserve someone to take advantage of those vulnerabilities and take advantage of them. They don't deserve that. And so that person who's done that to them needs to be removed. He's not fit for ministry.
Yeah. Do you think the church is, I think the Me Too movement kind of and then I guess the subsequent Church Too movement, I guess is what the hashtag they were using. Do you think that it's kind of helped the church move forward and actually being more victim focused rather than the other way around?
I think they are. Some of them are going kicking and screaming. I think some. I think some of them understand that this is something they can't sweep under the rug any longer.
Sure.
I think some of them still struggle with how to handle it and how to deal with it. And that's part of the problem with church failure is they don't have policies in place before it happens. There's also the failure to see it, not only as a moral failure, which the church is good at seeing that part of it, but failure to see it as a professional violation as well. They've broken those vows, and so it's a professional violation. And just like any other profession, there are standards that have to be met, and when you don't meet them, then you are no longer permitted to be in that position. So I think awareness has certainly helped the church move forward in this. But as I said, I've talked to so many victims, and I've talked to many church leaders, and there is still this hesitation to understand it in the way that makes it necessary so that we can respond in the way that we should.
Okay. Yeah. What should, if I was going to church and I knew somebody that had been a victim of, being abused by a pastor or whoever within the church, what should we say to them as opposed to not say to that victim?
Well, the first thing you want to say to any victim of abuse, whether it's clergy or other, is to remind them it was not your fault. Mm-hmm. This was done to you. Something was done to you. This didn't just happen, and you didn't participate. You didn't have the coping skills at the time to deal with this. You were taken advantage of. You were targeted by someone because they looked at you and saw vulnerabilities that they could take advantage of. So, even with me, many times I think back and say, well, I could have done or I should have. No, this was someone who was after me and was praying after me, who was going to use me. And so first thing you tell victims, remind them over and over, this was not your fault. Do not blame yourself for what was done to you by someone you should have been able to trust in a place that should have been the safest place on earth. Mm-hmm. The second thing I tell people, and this is so important, because people of faith are comforted by things like prayer and Bible study, they assume that it would be comforting to an abuse victim who's been abused by someone in the clergy. And quite honestly, it's just the opposite. Many of those things like prayer and Bible study and scripture reading that are comforting to someone of faith have the opposite effect on someone who's been abused by clergy, because those are trigger factors. Many victims had their perpetrator pray with them after they had sex, or they would use scripture just to twist the scripture to justify the relationship. And so when someone says to them, I will pray, let me pray for you, that can be a turnoff. So what I say to people is, you might want to say, just acknowledge that I understand prayer can be difficult for you because of what you've been through. Would it be okay if I pray for you? That acknowledges to the victim, hey, they kind of get it. And I'm not embarrassed to say, please don't pray for me. So that's the second thing. And then finally, if you can just listen. My friends were so generous in their time, because when I finally, after 27 years of silence, began to talk about my abuse, I couldn't talk about it enough. I needed to keep telling my story over and over to get it out. And so if you can just have a listening ear without being judgmental, without questioning, why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? It's such a gift to a victim to be able to just talk about their abuse.
Okay. Yeah, that's probably a big key, because we are so willing to talk and we want to ask questions, especially
and we want to help. We want to help.
Yeah.
And so we want to be able to give advice and we want to make it right for that person. But honestly, the best thing you can do is just let them talk as much as they want to talk, and bring lots of Kleenex.
Yeah, I bet. Wow. This is an incredible story. And again, thank you so much for being willing to share, your personal story and your journey. Let me ask you just a little bit about some of the stuff you're involved in now. You say you speak at conferences and various groups and organizations. Tell me a little bit about your activism as far as that's concerned.
I volunteer for a wonderful ministry called the Hope of Survivors. They help mostly adult women who've been abused by someone in the church, a spiritual leader. Their website is a wonderful website with a lot of information for victims. Because the other thing I tell victims is one of the best things you can do is educate yourself. Understand the dynamics of clergy abuse and understand how you were manipulated, understand how the grooming process was started with you so that you can see how this was a predator who preyed upon you. So I do volunteer work for the Hope of Survivors Ministry. I serve on the board of COCA, which is Council on Child Abuse. I speak at different churches and organizations. Now, of course, COVID-19 has limited those at this point. But I do some victim counseling. I don't do that as much because I'm not a trained counselor. So I just basically share my story with other victims and try to guide them to a place that they can get help. Jimmy Hinton, I don't know if you've heard of Jimmy Hinton. He's got a great website that talks that his father was a pastor and was abusing children. And he and his mother turned their father in. He's got a fascinating story. But he has a podcast as well. And so there's lots of information out there in books. In the back of my book, I have an appendix of different websites and books. I think I've forgotten your question, so I probably ranted right
No, that's is pretty much exactly what I was asking.
But, I do have advocacy work. Now, again, this didn't happen overnight.
Sure.
When I first had that trigger factor where I had to start dealing with this, it was 2 years before I could really start to process and really felt comfortable in my own skin being able to tell my story. And of course, telling my story, it's one thing, to say that I was sexually abused by my youth pastor, but it was another thing to have to write it down in detail in the book. And so that was a little different and a little more difficult for me, but I did it, and I was glad that I was able to do it as well.
How hard was it? I mean, did that really trigger? I mean, literally seeing those words on the page, was that really hard? It did.
And again, I had to tell it in detail. If I'm going to tell the story, it wasn't enough to say, I was sexually abused by my pastor, and then I did this and I did that. I had to pull out all the emotions so that the reader could understand, okay, this is why she didn't do this, and this is why she couldn't say no. So it was very difficult to write at times. Sometimes I just stopped writing when I couldn't do it any longer. Sure. I felt like I needed a break. But having said that, it was very cathartic in many ways.
That's good.
And I felt, I have to say, I just felt the presence of God. Every time I sat down to write, I just felt this calm and this peace that said, just write and let it come out and it'll be okay. And that's what I did. And of course, I had a supportive husband, which made all the difference in the world. And my friends were supportive. But yeah, writing the book was a challenge. But I'm glad that I did it. And I do know from the emails I've gotten and some of the mates on my website that there are people who have said to me, your book has helped me tremendously, or you've told my story. And it's the first time I've ever heard my story told by someone else. So I know that it's had an impact, and that was my purpose. So it was well worth any of the emotional baggage that I had to carry with it while I wrote it.
Okay. I have a question, but I don't know how to phrase it.
Go ahead and ask.
Well, the thing about being in Christian circles, in Western Christianity, at least, I guess I could say, and then, seeing the purity movement of the 90s and the early 2000s and that kind of stuff. And we have such a tendency within Christian circles to really focus shame around when we mess up, especially when it comes to sexual things, whether it be just being impure, teenagers had sex or something like that, or in your case, obviously something a lot more serious. But I wish there was a way or knew how we could start to try to get the church to understand that, like you said, we need to be more victim focused than anything, and we need to understand that this needs to be a safe place. And sometimes church doesn't feel like a safe place, especially for victims, and that's frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And your churches need to be welcoming to the victims. And I think they're afraid of us at sometimes is, that this is going to hurt the church. It doesn't hurt the church. Listen, the outside world understands this stuff goes on.
Yeah.
They understand this. What they don't understand is why you sweep it under the rug. What they don't understand is why you continually let this person go on and be a minister.
And that hurts the witness.
That hurts the church. Victims speaking out don't hurt the church. It's the response of the church that hurts the church. And that's the point of where we need to get churches to understand. And again, I think it goes back to that they want to be able to forgive, and they use the phrase as well, we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And so there's always this feeling that somehow we should let this person be forgiven and let them have a second chance. That's called church discipline, though. We need to have church discipline. And I remind church leaders, look, you're not doing anything to this man that he didn't already do to himself. The decision that he made when he decided to kiss me in my hallway, he decided his fate then.
Right.
You don't decide his fate. That fate was decided by himself.
Right. And forgiveness of that individual is not the same as making sure that person does not serve in that capacity.
They're separate and apart. You can still forgive and still discipline. And again, I think it's too quick.
And that's biblical. Right?
Imagine that.
What?
Imagine that. And also, we need to just keep in mind that it's not a punishment necessarily, but we also forgive too quickly. I mean, this man was moved to the next church. He now is being forgiven again. He remains in ministry, and that's none of that makes sense.
I can't even believe that. That is, that's mind-boggling to me.
Well, it should be. It should be. Yeah.
I don't even know how to respond. That is, well.
Well,
go ahead.
Here's the other thing. The point I'll make is that 27 times in the Bible where we are warned about false prophets and wolves in sheep's clothing. 27 times. So that should tell us, look, we shouldn't be surprised when these things do happen, because we're warned that these men are out there. And so we need the response is what we need to work on. And I know it's devastating to learn that your pastor has had sexual misconduct within his ministry. I get that. But after we know about it, then we need to work on it and say, okay, these are the steps we're going to take. Absolutely. And we're going to help that victim because she has been damaged beyond repair at some point. And we need to help her get her back to her own spiritual life, which was taken from her by this wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yes. Well, yes. Thank you, Sandy, for willing to be on the show tonight. Truly appreciate it. Once again, if you want to check out Sandy's book, it's called Let Me Pray Upon You.
Yeah, I actually have a copy, so I'll hold it up.
Very good.
I guess you can see that okay.
Yep. Actually, no, it looks great. Perfect. It's focused and everything.
Good. It's available on Amazon. Awesome. And I have a website, which is my name, Sandy Phillips Kirkham.
Okay. Awesome.
And they can find any more information. And I would encourage victims to really educate yourself and get out there and start learning everything you can about clergy sexual abuse. And just remember, you don't have to be defined by your abuse.
Yes, thank you. That's a good way to end it. Mm-hmm. And we'll make sure we have all of your contact information, including a link to your book in the show notes, so people can get a hold of you if they want. Will that be okay?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Sandy, for joining us tonight. We truly appreciate it.